The third form of restitution, this is development assistance, and really has only taken place in any large degree in South Africa, but it still is a useful model to think about in generally in restitution programs. And here, instead of the land and the property of the refugees being returned to the refugees, instead there's a big package deal which involves new housing, agricultural development, infrastructural development and other services. And this is all part of a huge reinvestment in the new political settlements, which allows the refugees to return, but not necessarily to their homes which they once owned. And it is a way, this has developed quite a bit in the thinking around refugee restitution, because it's understood that just returning to the house that you may have once had, or your grandparents once had, isn't enough for you to live there. You need some sort of livelihood, some sort of package of assistance which allows that to be a feasible option, and not just stones from the memories. And this is an increasingly important part of trying to understand what makes a successful return programme. In South Africa, this has been tried in some respects and has had many problems, partly to do with the very slowness, the long delivery points. It took a long time to put into practice. The information that was being used was unreliable, it was contested, whose land and who was entitled to having the assistance. And some of the assistance for refugees was not integrated into wider programs, and so there was some contradiction and competition with other programs. And the judicial process was very slow, so that there's an attempt to try and shift it to an administrative process to try and speed this up. The fourth kind of restitution is of a very different nature, and I just put it in here because I think this is obviously of some concern for people involved with the Palestinian case. What's interesting is that claimants are actually given very little choice, generally across the board. In very few of the cases that I looked at were people actually allowed much choice. It is assumed, generally, that restitution is the preferred option because compensation, financial compensation, which I'll come to, is usually limited to only a small percentage of the market value. You don't get the full market value of the property that it's worth. But what is quite common is that people may not want to return to the homes. They want the homes back, but they may not return to live in them, and they ask for restitution, and then they sell it. So this happened quite a lot in Bosnia, where people found too many of their neighbours had moved away, so they actually sold the property rather than move back to the place where they came from. It also was proposed in the Cyprus Agreement, or the Kofi Annan Plan, where secondary occupants, that means people who themselves were refugees, but were living in refugee homes, could choose whether to stay or to go back, to choose whether they exchange their property or not. And as I've mentioned, in post-communist Europe, there was some choice between restitution and compensation. People would sometimes prefer to take the cash, and then they go move into a rural area from which they would prefer to obtain a livelihood from. It was also tried in South Africa, and encountered many problems, partly because the system that was introduced in South Africa was based on a lot of the negotiations, and it was hard to get the whole community to agree. There were very many people involved, very many parties. Not all of them were available for part of the discussion. To get everybody involved was quite difficult. And there was a tendency to accept compensation, to at least come to a decision, rather than to be stuck. So turn now to the third form of reparation. So I've done satisfaction, I've done restitution. This is the third form, compensation. I think this is one that is more familiar to most of you, and I won't spend quite so much time on it. But this is compensation for lost property and sometimes also for the situation of being a refugee or refugeehood. And it takes very many forms. It can take the form of cash, it can take the form of vouchers, that means a sort of a cash equivalent, or it can take the form of some bonds, which is like a small share in an investment fund. There's many kinds of valuations. Sometimes they are 100%, very rarely. Sometimes, mostly they're a much lower percentage, you don't get the full market value. Sometimes it's the value on the day of dispossession plus inflation, which sometimes is better than full market value, sometimes it's worse. There's a lot of different ways in which these calculations are made. Another form of compensation is that rather than it going to individuals, it actually goes to whole categories of people, and particular groups, particular areas, people who may have suffered particular kinds of dispossession. Sometimes it goes to state agencies, sometimes it goes to voluntary bodies. And sometimes it goes to people whose needs are being fast-tracked, or sometimes they're being put into more complex categories. So the lump sums is a popular way of providing compensation because it deals with a lot of people in one go, but it's also quite nuanced and varied. And then there's also the per capita, everybody getting roughly the same amount, X number of dollars for X thousand dollars for a certain period. Some people say this is fairer, but then other people say, well, individuals who come from large families get a larger proportion of the amount, and other people say, well, you know, we may not have lost property, we come from a small family, but we had lots of assets, which movable assets, which are not part of the scheme. So it's very difficult to get a particular form of compensation which everybody says is fair.